Following themes of the first two lectures, in talking about housing, some attributes of the effects of density, and other problems of human settlement and human environment. She is a native Midwesterner, obtained her bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin, was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Sydney in Australia, received a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from Harvard University, and then obtained a PhD from Clark University. She has taught at the University of Pittsburgh, where she had joint appointments with the Department of Geography, the Department of Urban Affairs, and the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and was one of the people that headed the doctoral program in the Graduate School of Public Health in environmental planning. She has since University of Pittsburgh taught at Harvard University and is presently, was I out of this microphone before? I'm sorry. Is presently teaching at the Boston, Gwen? The Boston?
Architectural Center.
The Boston Architectural Center, which is better known to architects than it is to planners. Amongst other things, Gwen has served as consultant to a number of countries, the Philippines and Brazil, has edited Acoustics, a journal that you can find in the library on the 4th floor. Those of you who know where the library is on the 4th floor. For those of you who know where the 4th floor is. She is author of numerous significant papers and has written or edited a number of books on the environment, amongst which are Strategies for Human Settlements, which was commissioned for the UN Habitat Conference in Vancouver in 1976. The authors contained in that book include John Turner, which I recommend as someone you should read in regard to housing and the problems of developing countries. She has also edited or was one of the major writers in Urban Environment and Human Behavior and Human Identity in the Urban Environment. Amongst her other accomplishments, Gwen is also a mother and cook and bottle washer, and more importantly to me, Paul, Haig, Charlie, Alan, Juan, my friend, Gwen Bell.
I'm going to turn the, is this right? Okay. I'm going to turn the lights off very shortly and talk with a series of slides because I assume that people like to look at things, and I hope that they help make the points that I want to talk about. Some people call this my benign neglect lecture because you can walk out and say, she's just torn everything down like all academics do. You know, what do we do next? Don't take it that way, and it's not meant to be that way, and you know, you can pin me down later if I don't come up with some things that sound like not being just benign neglect about the world housing problem, because you'll find that most of the things that have been done by architects and planners, in my estimation, about trying to provide for the world housing needs just haven't worked. And what has worked is what people have done for themselves. And I've been interested in looking at and analyzing what people have done for themselves in hoping that all of us can help them do it somewhat better. So it's not benign neglect. And I'm organizing the lecture around some mythologies about the housing problem, some myths that I think that we all have. The first one, and now we can turn the lights off, is that there's a shortage of land. This, where everybody starts, it seems to be, is that there are too many people and there's not enough land to go around. Now, I've done this of the globe to symbolize the way we approach things. The abstract, if you think of the globe abstractly, just in terms of a big ball sphere, there is enough land, but when it's divided in the kinds of realities that are begin to put on the left-hand globe, you have various institutional regulations which makes some, there's a fly after me or something. Some places just much more desirable than other places, and everybody wants to be where everyone else is. And so one finds that coupled with land speculation, that you have perceived shortage of land, at least where everyone wants to be. And everyone seems to think that they have the right to turn the cornfield, which you have plentifully around here, into a crop of houses. It's a kind of an inalienable right to land speculation that has developed in the last 50 years or so. And it's one that's very difficult to take away. The best kind of planning schemes where they try and save the landscape and have an alternate form where they do save the land, generally is stopped by some family that says, you know, I can turn my corn into houses too. Unfortunately, you generally only grow one crop of houses on the land. And the one resolution that had some teeth from the Habitat and Human Settlements Conference, the big UN conference on human settlements, was that the unearned incremental value from property should go to the state. That was a resolution that was passed that said that there's more than having a problem. However, the resolution was passed by everyone who has now gone back to their own countries, and there is still land speculation. There are all kinds of squatters. There are new urban immigrants who can't buy land, and really nothing has changed, although people have said that this is one of the fundamental parts of the problem. The squatters, oftentimes, when they come to the city, try and find land that no one owns. Very often, something like 50% of the world populations in cities live in port cities. And very often in the port cities, they find the land that's not land, that's still water. And so they begin infilling land. On the right-hand side is Salvador in Brazil, and Alligados, which is alligator, is the name of a very large squatter settlement, which is almost all on reclaimed land by the people themselves. And on the right here is the Tondo squatter area outside of Manila, and you can see how the squatters encroach on the land, they throw on the water, they throw their garbage, and they build on stilts, and then they build up the land underneath the stilts, essentially with their own garbage, any trash they can find, and they will start moving out and infilling the area which is not owned, so that they can have a place to live near the center of the city. This also, on the left, is the Florida Keys, which is also being filled. and in some cases being stopped now. But the creation of land that is not now property is one of the favored ways to develop land near these favored sites. And I was reading the other day an article by a Japanese author, and he had noticed there's a national zoning now in Japan, and he said the problem with planning in Japan is that they plan by coloring, and there are only limited numbers of colors. And this was all in sort of broken English, but it was sort of fun. And he said it very simply because he didn't write very well in English, so I thought it was sort of well done. And so he said they colored all of the area in shallow water one color, saying that this is all land that can eventually be made for housing. And he said, and they forgot that in some of it there is good shellfishing, others are good beaches, but when you start planning by coloring, you get into these very simple kinds of ideas. And on the left, then, you find, again, outside of Tondo, more land being created, this time by the government, and on the right, the kind of natural infilling that takes place to increase the land, the living on water. And living on water itself is a way, in some cases, I mean, we live on water in the United States, and it's sort of another time of the year, and people do not think of it very seriously. In Hong Kong, where 1/3 of the people live on the water, the planners and the official housing reports essentially just forgot about the 1/3 of the population living on water. They're not considered to be housed. And this is another kind of myth. And that is, there's a myth when you read these reports that say people aren't housed. Now, everybody is housed. I mean, they could be housed in a drain pipe, and there are places in India where they live in drain pipes, but they serve tea in drain pipes, and that is their home. So everybody has some kind of a house. I mean, they could be underhoused, but the kind of statement that there are people just not living in houses is not looking at the right kind of question. It's looking at it from a very kind of architectural, structural approach. It's the kind of thing where they said in Greece after the war that people weren't going to school because there weren't school buildings. But when you saw a teacher teaching a group of children under a tree, they were learning. There might not be a school building. And the issue is not what kind of building it is, what kind of a structure, but it's what's happening, actually. The kind of private property, as we know it, spurs a kind of individualism towards the land versus a kind of communal approach. And what you see on the left is a kampong in Indonesia. And there are people now going to Indonesia and saying that, in fact, there is a housing problem because there isn't individual ownership of the individual plot where the individual house goes. The land, the adat law, the traditional law in Indonesia looks as a community and as a community owning a space and not as an individual in a house or, you know, that an individual plot of land can be owned. So that people now are advising, in fact, that in Indonesia they begin to change that law, and it's done on because of one of the problems that traditionally, this is Indonesia, and one of the parts of the kampong is the fish pond. And the fish pond is sort of the, you can see people sitting around the fish pond in the kampong fishing. Now, the little houses of retreat where you go and contemplate are above the fish pond, and all the garbage goes into the fish pond. Everything from the community ends up, the fish pond is the sink for all excrement of the entire community. And the fish from the fish pond is the pièce de résistance served to you at dinner. And it all works, and nobody gets sick. But it all works given certain levels of population. And in Indonesia, too, you get to a point in the fish ponds where there is a tragedy of the commons, where, in fact, the fish pond cannot take care of the number of people. So you have the cases where the kampongs get taken up by urbanization and get denser and denser, and then the fish ponds, in fact, don't work anymore. And the issue in terms of going and saying, let's change the law, and then the problem will change, is probably not appropriate. And I again, although I have gone out as an UN expert to other countries, see a real danger in applying some of the things that we think work in our situation the way they are in other places. And this first struck me in Australia when I was a student, and I saw English new towns and English planning done at the edge of the desert, and where the English said every town has to have a green belt. And so they would draw their plans and put the green belt around the community, and one has a green belt in a desert. And it just doesn't make any sense. It's a fire belt. It's an area of it's in no sense green, and it doesn't work, and it's the kind of rubber stamping from one culture, from one situation to another, something that probably doesn't work. Now, I'm getting away from my story of Indonesia, which there are still pictures up here of, and where you have this incredible number of people in a very small space. And the tragedy that there are not trees, it's been denuded of trees. It is the traditional kinds of approaches have come to a point in Indonesia where there is an environmental degradation. There's industry on the left. Here's a kampong in the middle of suburbia, which is virtually all one can call that. And as it continues like this, it is not going to work. Perhaps there is something that will work without applying the same kinds of fundamental property laws that we have. One of the things are more scientific approaches. On the right is oysters being grown in aquaculture, and one finds that in places that villages in Malaya, I know, have adopted forms of aquaculture that use scientific methods in a kind of way that apply to the traditional kind of life that they've had in their community, that in fact does work, that provides a new balance within their own frame of reference. Here is from the Indonesia kind of urbanization of the countryside, of the kampong being transformed into an urban unit. I'm now going to look through a progression of slides with you of squatter settlement, the Tondo area in Manila. And the Tondo area is a very politically volatile area. It was chosen the site of the international architectural competition that went along with Habitat, and because of that, and the kind of political awareness of these people was they knew in Vancouver, they knew in Tondo, which is a squatter area, and this is what it looks like. They knew when the items were on the agenda in Vancouver what was happening, so that they could coordinate demonstrations in Manila with an international conference going on in Canada. They're not politically naive about what will work in their country. And the mythology that I relate to this is that squatter housing and housing basically does not filter down. Housing filters up. That the sociology that I learned and that is still taught is, and the urban geography of the city, one learns about the filtering down of housing. In most areas around the world and in the United States, housing filters up. I think all of you could think about areas of your town where houses were built in the late 40s and early 50s that were simple little boxes and have since had garages and recreation rooms and swimming pools that have in fact filtered up over time. This certainly happens in the squatter settlements. So you can see the water there on the left, so that area is just recently filled area, and you find in many of the places that are on this made land, which they often have to go to, the worst housing, the poorest housing, is the newest housing, which is on the newest made land. And as you go in, you find various kinds of improvements on the housing. You can see there that the land now we're farther into the farther into the interior. The houses have been there longer and they have been progressively upgraded. And it's progressively upgraded in a variety of ways, and it's not always uniform. There's something very, relatively good next to something that's relatively poor. And you get the materials you can get. And some of it, as you can see on the right, and both of these houses get to be quite sophisticated housing. And this is in an area which was all built by the people. The land was built up by the people themselves. They don't own it. They improve it. And it was going to be partially torn down, at least, to have infill, and a new area built. The competition at Habitat was to build a new area to house these people. And while I was there and walked through the area, you had to be aware that in a squatter settlement, it's just not housing that you're talking about. You're talking about a whole economy that goes with it. That the people who came to the city and who have come to the cities have not come with industrialization, but they've come to a city and had to get generally some kind of tertiary employment. The fisherman is on the right, and on the left, the fish is drying out in the middle of the street, so that the production of food happens, the processing of food happens within the squatter settlements. These are on both sides, in the cases, pigs, and they're being taken to sell. And most families in in many squatter areas have some kind of livestock, and it goes from culture to culture what it is. I mean, in some cases it's chickens, some cases it's pigs. In Manila it's pigs, and a great deal of the wealth of the family is tied up in the pig. And as there are veterinarians that they will pay in the squatter areas to take care of their pigs, because this is a great deal of the wealth of the family. It's a kind of savings bank that they have that's right there. So there's food production going on. And there's other kind of industry. There's a lot of furniture, a lot of building. There are lots of shops. The one on the right is a very simple approximation of a shop, but there's an enormous amount of economic activity that goes on in a squatter settlement. It is by far not just housing, and it's relatively well self-regulated. The whole transport industry in many of the places takes place from the squatter settlements. And these are the jeepneys in Manila, which are really marvelous. And, you know, I could go through and have a whole slideshow of jeepneys and jeepney decoration, and I'm sure it would, you know, sort of enliven things very much more. I mean, everybody does something different. They're driven 24 hours a day. They're manufactured in squatter areas. They're kept at the edge of the area, and they're the informal method of transportation that really works. The major problem in the squatter areas are the services. And there on the right is the laundry drying. And on the left, you can see the water supply, which is the hose on the street. And just in the corner on the left is the sewer that's open. And probably one of the greatest impacts. Habitat took place in June of 1976. And the biggest impact, the thing that I saw hit the papers most and heard from people, were pictures of Margaret Trudeau carrying buckets of water for the Walk for Water. And that was to really publicize the next UN conference, which was in Argentina, on water, and say that the real need was to have clean water supplies for everybody, wherever they lived. And there are a lot of people who said that that was really detracting from this. But you've got to think, when there are these enormous United Nations slideshows and conferences, most of the work and the decisions have been taken a couple of years beforehand. And they're just sort of doing the sideshow then and getting everybody psyched up for the next thing. The other problem is that human settlements are just too big, too diffuse, and they couldn't get down. When someone would say, well, we really want to talk about water and the problem of infrastructure, somebody else would say, oh, well, there's the land problem. And somebody else would say, well, there's the banking problem, which I'm going to do all of this tonight. And they would say these all interrelate, and so it becomes very diffuse. The water issue, you can talk about having clean water. You can talk about bringing in infrastructure. And it's a precise kind of problem which has a technological element, which is nice to handle because it's not perceived to be as politically as problematical as some of the other ones. So there you can see the kinds of reasons for it. There's some more. And here on the left, you can see those are the water buckets. They're at essentially a water main, and then they will take buckets to in fact supply the water to the houses. And here you can see one of the other industries, of course, is the water supply industry, which keeps many young people employed. And it's mainly sort of mainly boys, about 8 to 12, who line up with their buckets and tins and then carry it to the various houses. And there is the man working on hose. And this is water. One of my students was looking at the squatter settlements around Madras and found that in fact where a lot of the settlements were taking place was along the water line from the reservoir to the city, and it was illegal tapping off a water supply, which would be the nucleus of a settlement. Because jobs, they are attracted to the city, but it's a tertiary kind of service employment. The focus isn't on particular industries. They look for similar people where they can get support from a community, and they fundamentally have to have a supply of water. And this is, it's very difficult to get that. Now, in Tondo itself, there's already renewal going on. This is a government-constructed road there was clearly a lot of clearance on both sides so that they could bring in water supplies, bring in building supplies. That's taking place. That's one of the reactions against the government. And there you can see the development authority and the kind of control. The whole place is organized in terms of communities and it's not clear where you get the control versus the local control. There's a great deal of control in a place like the Philippines from above, as well as a barangay, which is supposed to be a popular community group that is self-governing from below. In the community also, there are these community reading centers, community activities, various kinds of professional things, and the whole business of having a lot more than housing, the work, and is a kind of upholding of the law. And I've been doing some work on work within communities in the United States and find that the largest subversive activity in the United States is home occupation, people who work at home. And I'm sure that a number of the people here, a number of architects who have some offices in their homes, are disobeying their local zoning ordinance. And it's a kind of endemic pattern throughout the United States. And it's something that happens because we all know that it happens. It's totally illegal. And we do it completely by having good neighbors. When I talk to anybody who is running an illegal business out of their home, and I say, and the whole reason you'd get reported would only be if your neighbors turned you in. And they know that you're illegal, and it makes you a very good neighbor. Automatically, you become, you will do anything so that your neighbor won't do this. You generally keep the keys for the neighborhood kids. You do all kinds of things. So that the whole kind of approach to having businesses and other kinds of activities within the residential housing area is not really foreign to what's going on in our own country. And so, you can look at it and maybe take it in more because that's, it's happening someplace else. And then, you say, well, it's happening to me too. Now, one of the things that planners can do is figuring out ways to make things legitimate. Now, and that's legitimizing things, making things work. And I think in Athens, they really were very clever about it, because in Athens, you cannot build on holy ground, on ground that the Greek Orthodox Church ever built on. And so there you see a Greek Orthodox Church, and above it is the Ministry of Education. And there were people who did find a way to get around that. That's what I sort of got. What you have to be careful of in being professionals in places like Tondo, and which I wanted to say a couple of minutes ago, was that there's a fine line between professionalism and paternalism, on the keeping Manila clean, on those kinds of things of where are you paternalistic to a group of people that you want to keep down there, and when are you being a professional and figuring out ways that can help them figure out ways to help themselves. One thing that planners do relatively well is to look at the large scale and the undercover problems, and figure out how things work that you don't see. One thing that I don't think planners do very well, and that I think that there's a problem, is a myth that the social survey is really going to tell you anything. Most of them go out and talk to the people and say, would you like to live in a better house? Yes, I'd like to live in a better house. Would you like to live in a high-rise building? Well, that's that fancy new place. Yes, that looks like a nice place to live. And they don't understand. I mean, it's a kind of oversimplification of the whole thing, but I have read too many surveys from too many places that get sent to me as an editor, where you come out of that, yes, I would like to live in better housing, is where you get to the end of that. I think that planners can do a lot more by looking. And as you look, you can begin to see all kinds of different things that are happening. One of the things that I did, and it didn't take very long to do, was as I walked through Tondo once, I cataloged something like 31 different games that were being played. They were, and all you, but you sort of set yourself a problem, and then you see a lot more than when you haven't. There's an enormous amount to see when you start looking before you start asking. And their game of basketball is fascinating, because the streets were so small. You see, that's a very small net and a little ball. There just wasn't room to play. So they had figured out a way that they could play basketball. There's probably the most famous looking story that I know is the story that Charles Abrams told and saw. And this was a man who really did a lot of the early housing, and who died 7 or 8 years ago, and was in Ghana, and in the late 50s. And there was no banking system in Ghana at the time. And they were trying to understand the housing problem. And as he went around, he looked and he said, but I see piles of brick. And what are these piles of brick? And someone said, well, people can buy a brick at a time. That they can get together a few cents to buy a brick. And then eventually they can put the bricks together into a wall. But they can't get enough money together to get a roof. so that even if they get enough bricks to make 4 walls, they can't get a roof. So he said, well, then we can, if they can build 4 walls, they have collateral, and we can loan them money for a roof. So he saw that there was a way, and from this way they developed a banking system that where people hadn't banked, they could by showing that they had 4 walls, they could then get money and build roofs. Now, one of the other kinds of problems that come up is the professional attitude towards squatter clearance. Generally, people have started to call it re-squatting. But every time, and it's well known, every time there's a squatter clearance program, there's re-squatting. And generally it happens, it's more infill on smaller pieces of land, and it never completely does the job. So that, you have infill re-squatting and you have massive re-squatting. The kinds of invasions that have taken place in Latin America. The other kind of alternative is that after you take people out, you give them a new place, a resettlement scheme. We will take the squatters and we will move them to a new place. On the left is the resettlement place for the people who were in the Tondo in Manila. It's farther away from the center of the city. You have all the same problems of having to fill in land, and it's further out. It's where no one wants to go. The place on the right is Das Marinas, another resettlement place, which is way out in the country and has nothing to do with anything, and it's getting people away. The problems of resettling has been enormously expensive. Here's a resettlement camp on the right. Generally, another thing that we have learned is that there's no kind of quick technological fix for the housing problem. Mechanization means enormously expensive housing. Almost any way that you begin to compare mechanized, large-scale housing, it's much more expensive than what people can build for themselves. There have been, people are still saying, can we do prefabrication? Is there hope in that? The right is a picture of an experimental prefabrication system in Brazil. And of course, there are lots of large construction companies, international companies that are trying to sell various kinds of prefabrication scheme, but they are not the kinds of, there's no way that they can economically compete with what the people can do for themselves. And furthermore, they often import material and don't use the local material. Now, another thing that planners generally do when they consider housing is that they consider that an end state of a plan. And there is an old Arab proverb that says, when you stop building your house, you start to die. Now, I don't understand Arabic, so I don't know the precise verbs, but I would guess that you would have a mud house. And when you stop repairing and fixing up that mud house, or if you have a tent, you stop repairing and fixing that up. Either you aren't capable of doing it, or you start to die, or one process or another. So thinking of a beautiful end state, which generally has a great period of this kind of thing on the left, of, massive bulldozer, and it looks like it's been bombed, and you're walking through a crater or something. That the end state is probably not the state that may be the most healthy state. That what you've got is a lot of intermediate states before you get to the end state, and it's sort of not that perfect plan on what's going on. So as you look around, it's sort of, one of the things that happens is this business of where people are playing actually versus where you have planned for them to play, or what they are doing actually versus what you have planned where you think they should go. People always want to be where they're not supposed to be. And there you can see the little group in the doorway. It's always looking at this kind of thing versus of what's really going on versus what was drawn on the plan to go on, and then also that this final built process is the right process. It's the kind of myth of the nice environment that what really is wanted is this finished state, like your house looks the minute before you're going to have a party or have your mother over or do something like that. Probably the more creative time is when everything is in absolute chaos, and you may have to wade through, but it's the same for the environment, that a healthy environment is not always a nice environment, is always not a neat environment. It's not always the planned environment that some planner or some architect thinks it should be. Just the bingo Saturday night versus where the men who you really can't see. The environment on the right is one of the most expensive high-rise condominiums in Sao Paulo, for the kids to play, where clearly the kids are not playing. These kids are not, they're probably with their nannies or whoever it is being taken someplace. And the problem of high-rise housing for families is something that people are finally getting around to see. In Singapore, there are children who are 5 and 6 years old who've never been on the ground, literally, that live in the Singapore housing projects that are beginning, who have never gone downstairs, who have lived in a small set of rooms. There are the key kids in France who do not relate to a place with don't relate to land and don't relate to a place of their own other than as a kind of cell in a tall building. And the whole problem of sort of putting people who live as people live on the left into mass housing, into tall buildings, mean that they have to live according to a whole different set of rules. On the left, in the middle of the street on the bottom, is a heap of hot charcoal. It looks gray. It's hot. That's what they're going to cook their midday meal on. You move into a housing project, and you've got to get gas for a gas stove. You don't have some wood that you can essentially, even if you're moved in. And the way this has been stated previous has been a kind of negative way. You suddenly have a whole set of accoutrements that you have to have, a whole set of furnishings that you didn't have when you lived essentially in the squatter settlement. I mean, the differences are enormous. There, you can see the furniture you have to have. On the right is the looks of what happens when you do try and put squatters into a high building. And they know how to operate, they know how to live, but they cannot live in a high building. It's very hard to have a pig in a high building. And it's the same. Gypsies in Ireland, who they tried to settle in high buildings, wanted to take their horses with them. And this is 2 years ago. I am not talking about 10 or 20 years ago. And they couldn't take their horses with them. It was part of their life. So, and it's really, it relates, the tall building is related to the quick technological fix that isn't there. Squatter settlements are going to be not very pretty. They're going to progress slowly, but they will progress and they will filter up. As John Turner says, it's treating housing as a verb and not as a noun. This is not to speak of the kind of identity problem that you have in living in one of those situations. It's large buildings are really the number kind of phenomena taken to its furthest logical extent. Computers do not say that we have to live by numbers. They're there to help us. But you can't escape from sort of living by a number in a box when your choice are only large buildings. Now, there is really a reason for applying intermediate technology and appreciating the local technology. This is in the town of San Luis, which is north in Brazil and is very poor. And the picture on the left gives you a kind of feeling of what the old colonial town was. The picture on the right is what the immigrants into the outside of the city are living in. And they're again in a seacoast city, so they're down low. And there you have a kind of benevolent, paternal mayor who said, well, what he would do was he would build roads, and when he would bring the roads into these areas, he would just bring too much material for the roads, and they could cannibalize the building materials from the roads and build their houses. So, in the morning, the trucks drive up with the road material, and the next day the trucks have to come up with the road material for the same day, and they sort through it, and there they are, sort of having sorted through the road material and gone from their mud house, which they will now start improving. And here we are elsewhere in Brazil in cooperative, which is also has improved from the little houses like that, which are part of a cooperative, to the much better houses over time. there you can see, and again, the different ways that individuals have treated the improvement. The other kind of applying intermediate technology and appreciating the traditional kinds of technologies and the ways of slowly improving. And they're with the tile roof on one side and the thatch on the other, is a slow method of improvement. You know, not all of the kinds of things are going to be appropriate or work, and it certainly doesn't make any sense to have ropes and buckets and imported material. It's applying a whole system that works together, that uses the local material, that appreciates the local way of life, that appreciates the local people. The house on the left, I appreciated personally because that doorway just fit me. It wouldn't fit your dean. You know, I find an American kitchen terrible. It doesn't fit me. But yeah, we build for the norm, but there are lots of different norms than we think of right here. And some places the local construction is very gorgeous.